was mid-sentence, explaining why the latest acquisition would reshape the energy market, when his phone started to vibrate against the tabletop. The boardroom cameras kept rolling. The slides kept flipping. Ricardo Almeida's voice stayed steady for another beat. Then a small, muffled sound broke the cadence of his presentation, the tremor of a child's whisper that could not belong to his polished, ordered life. "Daddy, I'm hungry. Mum won't feed me." The words arrived thin and urgent across the speaker. For a moment the numbers on the screen blurred into a smear of color. His assistant cleared her throat. The conference call awaited his command. He felt the room tilt the way a ship tilts before it corrects course. Every protocol that governed his days, the scheduled flight times, the talking points, the legal briefings, evaporated in the face of two syllables. "Daddy, hungry." Ricardo cut himself off. He ended the call without ceremony. The applause track of corporate momentum died in his ear. He rose, palms damp against the polished wood, and told the room he needed to leave. The murmurs were hushed. He felt ridiculous and raw at the same time. A billionaire taken down to human scale by a child's exposed need. He booked the first flight home and grabbed a black jacket without folding it properly. He called Clarice on his way out, but her reply came through like a practiced script. Calm, measured, the voice of someone who had rehearsed composure. "Everything's fine," she said. "Isabella fell asleep early." He tasted the lie in the syllables. He didn't hang up. He didn't ask for details he already knew he would not get. On the car ride to the airport, the city passed by like someone else's set. Glass facades catching late afternoon light, drones crisscrossing the skyline, valet attendants offering polite bows. He imagined the house the way executives imagine balance sheets, line by line. He replayed scenes he had missed, the missing dinner at a board dinner a week ago, the hurried goodnights before red-eye flights, the teacher's email about a thin blouse slipping down Isabella's shoulders. He had been an absent architect of their life. Wealth had bought him distance, and the illusion that distance was safety. Now that illusion unraveled with every mile. On the plane, he pressed his face to a window and watched coastlines bend away. He had spent a life building empires and managing risks. He had never imagined the most dangerous thing he could miss would be his own child's hunger. He thought of his father, the way sons sometimes do in crisis, as a man who would have known how to hold anger and tenderness both at once. He promised himself he would not fail like that. The flight was a blur. The drive from the airport, an accelerating collage of glass and gates, and the fine-grain anxiety of a man unprepared for a different kind of deal. He slid through the front gate of the estate before the sun had set properly. The house that had always struck him as a comfortable, tasteful fortress, marble floors, muted art, staff who moved like parts in a machine, felt suddenly too bright, the shadows too deep. He could tell, before he entered, that the downstairs kitchen was immaculate, counters so polished you could see the reflection of a silk robe thrown over a chair. Champagne corks in an ice bucket, glinting as if in a different life. Isabella was in the bedroom at the top of the stairs. The hallway smelled like lemon cleaner and perfume. Her door was shut. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, more urgently. The door opened a crack, and there she stood, a little figure in pajamas that hung loose, her hair in a messy braid, eyes wide like a startled animal. She clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her voice, when she recognized him, was as small as the whisper he'd heard on the phone. "Daddy," she said. "I was hungry." He crossed the room in 2 steps and scooped her up. He expected the weight of a 7-year-old. He felt something lighter, a fragile, startling lightness that set his teeth on edge. Her arms tightened. There was no strength behind the embrace, only seeking. He caught the outline of ribs where the pajama fabric clung. He saw the slight dullness in her eyes that didn't belong to a child who had eaten regular meals. There was a smear of dried cereal on the collar of her pajama top. None of these things screamed violence. They whispered neglect. Still, the whisper cut straight through Ricardo's chest. Clarice arrived in the doorway as he held Isabella. She was flawless in a way designed to disarm. Silk blouse, a tailored skirt, lips that held the right expression of concern. But her concern was the kind you read in press statements, measured, carefully carved. "What is going on?" she asked, voice cool as a studio light. Her eyes slid over him and then down to the child in his arms. Not quite surprise, not quite guilt, something like annoyance at being disrupted. Ricardo asked the first of a dozen questions. Where had their daughter been? Why was there no food in her room? Did Clarice know anything about dinner? Clarice's answers were sharp and practiced. Isabella had skipped dinner earlier. Clarice had been occupied with a charity dinner downtown. The nanny had assured her the child was fine. She suggested he was overreacting. She said the word imagination as a kind of legal device. She noted, pointedly, that Isabella's pediatric records were up to date. But his eyes had already gone to the kitchen. The kitchen door was closed. He pushed it open and found discreetly a small cabinet with a padlock on the inside. The pantry itself held nothing fresh. Neatly organized bottles of artisanal jams, vacuum-sealed gourmet items, a chest of preserved goods behind a lock that seemed meant to keep things out of reach. In the refrigerator, plates of food arranged like museum pieces, the plated leftovers of an evening he had not attended. A bouquet of flowers still drooped with the last evening's wine. "Why is there a lock?" he asked, voice low. Clarice's smile thinned. "We keep certain things locked away. For discipline," she said. Her eyes did not look away. The way she framed it, as control, not neglect, was rehearsed. She used the word structured as if it were a virtue. The room smelled like citrus and control. He took Isabella back into his arms and walked straight out of the house. He did not say where he was going. He had no patience for the kinds of explanations that smoothed over harm. He drove to the nearest hospital like a man running a code. The emergency room in the private clinic they used often had the kind of minimalism that reassured donors and made patients feel they had arrived in a place that saw and could fix everything. It did not matter. He wanted someone to tell him, in a language without euphemism, what they saw. Dr. Paulo Mendes was waiting with the sort of directness Ricardo respected. Paulo's hands were sure and unhurried. He examined Isabella methodically, making notes, asking a series of gentle, standard questions. He weighed her. He charted the numbers that made the diagnosis precise, clinical, impossible to wave away, a weight that fell well below the expected percentile for her age, pallor in the conjunctiva suggesting low iron, brittle hair that suggested nutritional stress. The blood work measured deficiencies that had crept in over time, low hemoglobin, signs of dehydration, vitamin deficits consistent with inconsistent meals. Paulo's voice was even when he spoke the words everyone feared. "This is moderate to severe malnutrition," Dr. Paulo said. "Not immediate life-threatening in this moment, but definitely a pattern. She needs monitored refeeding, supplements, and a social services referral. These markers don't happen overnight." Ricardo felt the syllables like punches. And yet, for all their gravity, there was a measure of relief in the clarity of the diagnosis. It turned the whisper into words. It turned the shadow into an actionable fact. He watched the doctor chart the notes, felt the weight of paperwork like a ledger balancing. A social worker came that afternoon, Fernanda Costa, in a sensible blazer carrying a leather folder. She used the language of assessment with calm authority. "We are obliged to open a protective investigation," she said. "I will need a statement, and we will conduct a home visit. For now, we will document the child's condition and work with medical professionals on an immediate safety plan. Clarice stood in the doorway of the exam room like a statue. Her hands were folded in an effort at composure. She said slowly, in a voice meant to be heard by any microphone that might be present someday, that she loved Isabella, and that she had merely been trying to teach discipline. "It's not neglect," she said. "Certainly not." The social worker kept her expression useful and non-judgmental. "Discipline does not include withholding food," Fernanda replied. "We are looking at evidence of systemic deprivation. We will need to speak to household staff and review any security footage or logs." The staff came forward in a tremulous parade. Dalva, who had been their nanny until last month, had resigned under pressure. Julia, who managed the household on Clarice's watch, had made herself small. The most important voice, however, belonged to someone who had no interest in being in the room of power ever again. Lourdes, the family cook of 15 years. Ricardo had not expected to see her at the hospital. She stood with the dignity of someone who had made a choice to speak when silence would be complicity. "I used to hide snacks," she said when Fernanda asked. Her voice was low but steady. "The child would come to the kitchen in the evenings. She'd be hungry. I gave her crackers, sometimes milk. Clarice found out. She called me into her office and said I was overstepping. She fired me that same day." Ricardo watched Lourdes draw her hands together as if to hold herself whole. She described, without theatrics, instances when Isabella had tugged at a sleeve and asked for bread, and when staff had been told to lock certain areas. "I thought I was saving her," Lourdes said. "I couldn't see a child starving, I couldn't." There was no flourish in the sentence, only the quiet, unbearable human truth. Someone had tried to help, and in doing so had been punished. Fernanda took the cook's statement and wrote carefully. Fernanda then asked Ricardo if he wanted to make a formal complaint. The answer was obvious. Yes, he would, but he would also do more. He had to be present in a way that previous schedules had not permitted. He signed paperwork and typed a mess of messages to lawyers he only used for acquisitions and tax strategies, but whose faces he now saw differently. He called his private security chief and asked for every camera log on the property. He asked for timestamps and records, who entered the pantry, who last stocked the refrigerator. Information became the lifeline. That same night, in a sterile follow-up room, a pediatric nutritionist explained refeeding protocols. They would introduce nutrients slowly, monitor electrolytes, give iron supplements, start a schedule of small, frequent meals, rituals that felt, to Ricardo, like the precise stitching back together of something delicate and valuable. He watched Isabella eat a few spoonfuls of porridge, her eyes brightening with the first warmth in days. It was not miraculous. It was incremental. After 30 minutes she slept with her head on his shoulder, breathing easier. He thought of the lock again, the pantry behind which gourmet produce waited like hidden treasure. He thought of the philanthropic charities Clarice chaired, of press photos where she smiled with children and ribbon-cutting scissors. The contrast between the polished image and the raw fact of his daughter's need made his anger a slow burn. But he kept his anger contained. For now, the priority was her health and safety. Fernanda explained the process in plain terms. The hospital would document and notify Child Protective Services. They would draft a safety plan that could include temporary removal of the child from the household, pending a full investigation. It was a legal mechanism meant to protect the child in moments when the adult care environment was in question. For a man who was used to moving markets, the rules of protective custody felt like a set of new instruments to learn. Clarice called his phone more than once that evening. He let it ring. When he picked up, she was measured and cool, asking for updates, pretending at concern between the seams of her practiced voice. "Don't make decisions based on panic," she said finally. "We can manage this without making a scene. Think of the family." Ricardo thought of scenes and how they are manufactured. He thought of the documentary shots of Clarice handing out meal boxes on camera. He thought of Isabella's small hand in his, and how the only thing that mattered was being present. He felt the thing that men of his world are rarely permitted to feel in public, the pure, disruptive insistence of love. Outside, the estate felt unchanged, but the staff who remained were watchful, glancing at each other with folded questions. A text arrived from Pedro Carneiro, an investigative journalist who would later be persistent. "Heard rumblings. Call me if you're ready." Ricardo did not call back. The story was not yet his to tell. They admitted Isabella for observation overnight. Ricardo sat up in a plastic chair, the kind designed for short shifts, and watched his child sleep. He thought about the long list of compromises it had taken to become someone who could own islands and helipads and art collections, and he counted the cost in small absences: missed dinners, transatlantic speeches, the substitution of present parenting with gifts and devices. The ledger of his life rearranged itself in his mind into a simple equation: presence equals protection. At dawn, Fernanda returned with a preliminary report. She read the words with the bluntness of someone trained to turn emotion into procedure. "We observed signs consistent with prolonged food deprivation," she said. "Medical charts, witness statements, and the household inventory suggest a pattern. I will be filing for an immediate safety plan and requesting temporary protective custody while we investigate." Clarice arrived at the hospital with lawyers in tow. She glided into the room like someone stepping into a photo shoot, eyebrows arched, condolences ensured. Her lawyer, Dr. Marcelo Santos, spoke in careful tones about the rights of parents and the presumption of good faith. He insisted that any action taken be proportional and cautioned against headline-driven interventions. His language was the language of delay and dilution. Ricardo felt a clarity he had never felt in corporate negotiations. That speed could be protection. He signed the paperwork Fernanda placed before him, giving consent for medical treatment and for an immediate investigation. He would not wait for PR cycles or for the careful chipping away of truth. He would act. The steps they took after were precise and mundane, in the legal way that makes them final. Hospital clerks stamped forms. A photographer's flash would take a few sterile clinical images for the chart. Security logs were requested from the estate. Phone records subpoenaed. In the informal sense, he activated teams who would later be instructed to preserve evidence. He called a lawyer he trusted in family matters, Dr. Helena Ribeiro, and asked to assemble everything needed for an emergency custody application. Helena's voice was practical. "We move today," she said. "We do not publicize. We preserve. We prepare for a court motion. But preparations are not actions." And Clarice did not wait. She arrived at the hospital, composed, and made a show of concern on camera when an opportunistic news van, tipped by someone in the orbit of the household, rolled up. Her team began the careful script of the defensive public figure, statements about love, about family, about a misunderstanding. "This is a private matter," her spokesperson said to a reporter. "We are cooperating fully with authorities." Inside, the hospital staff kept the focus where it should be. Dr. Paulo reviewed the lab results and explained the immediate medical needs. "We will start a controlled refeeding plan," he said, "and we will monitor for refeeding syndrome. We must be cautious and consistent. Psychological support is also essential. She has experienced neglect and will need trauma-informed care." Ricardo agreed to every intervention. He felt, in that quiet list of clinical recommendations, the framework for his responsibility. He would show up to appointments. He would staff members who could sit with a child at night. He would change his calendar. He would learn how to make food with the small things undone. He knew none of this would reverse what had happened, but it was the first set of stitches. As the days stretched, the first cracks of a different battle began to appear. Clarice's legal counsel sent a message that they planned to contest any immediate removal of the child from the house. Their argument that an emergency separation would be traumatic had a certain theatrical cruelty to it, as if being left without reliable meals did not leave trauma in its wake. Ricardo felt something more than anger. He felt a responsibility to shield not only his child, but also those who had tried to help her. Lourdes had been brave. She had been fired for kindness. He thought of the way power shields itself, and how sometimes it does so at the expense of a child's belly. Fernanda, patient and thorough, explained the sequence the social services office would follow: statements from staff, a formally documented timeline of food access, a look at Clarice's charity calendar and notes from volunteers, and an immediate family assessment. She also warned that families with influence often had the means to make the process complicated. "People will try to control the narrative," she said. "Our job is to keep the child's safety first. We rely on documented evidence." And she placed Lourdes' statement into a folder, crisp and plain. Ricardo's phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, some venomous. A private account associated with Clarice's philanthropic work began to circulate a carefully worded post about misunderstandings and the family's commitment to the child's well-being. Another source leaked a cropped photo of Isabella from a summer gala, the kind of image meant to suggest normalcy. Ricardo ignored the noise. He focused on forms, on hospital notes, on the small progress of a child who ate a second spoonful of porridge. Late that evening, in a small, quiet office at the hospital, Fernanda laid out a temporary plan. Isabella would remain under medical observation. Fernanda would file for a temporary safety order that would restrict Clarice's access to the child pending investigation. The move would be administratively heavy and emotionally charged. It could set off a chain of legal filings and public statements. Ricardo thought of the headlines that might come, the way his name and Clarice's name would be woven into other people's narratives. He turned the variables over in his mind and chose to accept whatever fallout came, if it meant a safe place for Isabella. As he signed his consent for the protective action, he felt a look from Clarice full of everything she had always reserved for public moments: reproach, disbelief, a cool sense of being wronged on behalf of an image. She gathered her composure and said, softly enough only for them to hear, "You'll regret making this public." It was not a threat so much as a prediction, uttered by someone practiced in turning calamity into leverage. Ricardo felt the old instinct in him briefly, to meet fire with fire, to use resources to crush dissent. But the man he wanted to be now felt different than the one who maximized deals. He wanted safety, not revenge. He wanted constancy for a child, not the satisfaction of defeating an image. He thought of calling his security detail, of asking them to stay nearby, to shield the hospital door. He thought of hiring private nurses. He thought of little rituals he could begin: reading at bedtime, consistent meals, a particular stuffed rabbit returned to the shelf every morning. He signed the documents and chose presence over projection. Outside the hospital, as the city took on the blue-grey of night, someone from Clarice's team called a press contact known for speed. They spun a short line, a private family matter to be resolved discreetly. The first tweet arrived within the hour. The first speculation followed. At home, in the empty marble kitchen that had suddenly become a scene of evidence, a small padlock lay on the counter. It was unremarked by the staff who had been ordered to put it away. But for Ricardo, it was an emblem of a larger problem: how easily wealth can be used to make rules in private that would be intolerable in public. He picked up the lock, turned it in his hands, and felt its weight. He imagined it on the ledger of his life, a small addition that would require undoing. He slept in a pull-out chair beside Isabella's hospital bed. She moved in the night and woke with a little sigh of hunger that was at once animal and human. He fed her spoon by spoon and watched her small face relax with each bite. The guilt pricked, and then softened into a sort of fierce resolve. He could not change the past, but he could begin the slow work of repair. In the morning, Fernanda would begin the process in earnest. Statements, evidence requests, interviews with the house staff. Ricardo would authorize an internal audit of the household, security logs, food orders, a review of nanny schedules. He knew Clarice's circle would respond, and he braced himself for the pushback that powerful people know how to stage. Narratives rewritten, witnesses silenced by fear of losing livelihood, legal maneuvers that could make even straightforward facts feel muddy. But in the sterile early light of the hospital room, none of that mattered. Isabella drew a sun on a sheet of paper with a lentil of focus only a child can muster. Beside it, she wrote 2 words in large, uneven letters: "Daddy happy." Ricardo read it and let himself smile for the first time in days. It was a small thing, a child's drawing, and yet it anchored him like a cornerstone. He felt then, with a clarity so clean it stung, that everything he did from that moment on would be measured by whether it helped the little girl making suns with scribbled crayons. He would learn the rules of this other arena, how to preserve evidence, how to protect witnesses like lords, how to manage a media tide without losing the child's dignity. He would learn, too, that money could buy speed, but not absolution, and that the most valuable currency in this fight would be time, the slow accrual of meals, of trust, of consistent bedtime rituals. For now, the immediate battle had a single metric: stabilize the child, document the harm, and begin a safety plan that would not be derailed by a campaign of image control. Fernanda promised to draft the temporary safety order that afternoon. Dr. Paulo set out the next steps for medical care. Lords's signed statement sat in a folder. Ricardo placed the drawing of the sun in his pocket like a small talisman and stepped out into the corridor, where Clarice's lawyer awaited with clipped courtesy and thin smiles. The lawyer spoke of procedures and rights. Ricardo listened. He had spent his life listening to arguments meant to keep things the way they were. This time he intended to listen, then to act differently. He called Helena, his family attorney, and set her in motion. She began to assemble the motions and the medical records that would, in time, tell the story of neglect with the kind of procedural clarity courts require. The first moves had been made. The tiny crystalline pivot of a child's phone call had cracked an empire's complacency. But for every document they gathered, there was a counter-move waiting in the wings, statements to be denied, narratives to be spun, livelihoods to be threatened. Ricardo braced himself for the fight, but his first and truest priority remained unchanged and simple: make sure his daughter would not go hungry again. Outside in the street, a hush had fallen over the estate as representatives of social services and the hospital orchestrated safe transport. Clarice left the hospital in a car with tinted windows, her face unreadable in its carefully arranged neutrality. The media had already begun to circle, cameras waiting for the faces the story would give. Ricardo watched her go, feeling a mix of fury and something colder, an awareness that this was now out of the private sphere. But even as the first headlines were drafted, he held close the small drawing in his pocket and the image of his daughter, asleep, against his shoulder. When Fernanda handed him the preliminary paperwork, a temporary safety plan, restricting Clarice's unsupervised access to Isabella pending a full investigation, he signed without hesitation. The paperwork had the gravity of an instrument that both protected and complicated lives. It was neither dramatic nor redemptive in itself. It was a measure designed to buy space for truth to surface. For the first time in a long time, Ricardo cancelled a transatlantic board meeting and rearranged his schedule around school visits, nap time, and appointments. He made calls, not to secure investments, but to ensure there would be a stable nanny on staff who had nothing to do with the previous regime. He ordered simple groceries, arranged for a nutritionist to consult privately, and sat in the hospital corridor with Lourdes as she told another version of events in quieter, fleshier detail. Lourdes's eyes, rimmed with fatigue, tracked his face, as if measuring whether he would be different. "We have to keep her safe," Lourdes said. "We had no voice before." He promised. He felt the shape of the promise in his chest, no longer a pledge to a brand, but to the small hands that now trusted him enough to draw sons. The rest, the hearings, the press, the legal counters, would test that promise. But promises are made at the beginnings of things. They are practical acts as much as they are statements of intent. That evening, as Isabella ate a plate of rice and soft vegetables, she looked up at him with a seriousness rare for a child her age. "Can we go to the park tomorrow?" she asked. "If you want," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. She smiled, small and immediate, and in that smile was the precise thing he'd been missing, the evidence that being present mattered. He leaned back and let the weight of the day settle like dust. There was still so much to be done. The protective order would be just the first paper in a folder that would later hold testimonies and lab results and security footage. There would be witnesses to protect and a public to manage. Clarice's defenders would mobilize. But for tonight, he kept his child close and began in 1,000 small ways to build a new routine that would not be punctured by the machinery of image control. The sun rose the next morning on a day that would rearrange more than family schedules. In offices he had not frequented for years, lawyers read medical charts with the same focus they had once reserved for acquisition clauses. Fernanda met with staff to collect statements. A security team digitized and preserved footage from the estate. Lourdes provided a signed account that would later be corroborated. Each piece of evidence clicked into place, like a gear in a mechanism designed to preserve a child's safety. Still, the most important work was silent. The way the spoon dipped and the way a hand smoothed hair before sleep. He marked each small victory, a steady meal, a full night's sleep, a laugh that arrived without question, and let them accumulate like a ledger of healing. He had the resources to move quickly. He had to use them to create constancy, not headlines. And somewhere in the bureaucracy and the briefing memos, someone filed the first legal papers that would keep their daughter safe, while the truth, in all its complicated particulars, came into view. The fight had begun. But at the center of it all was a small girl with a new appetite for porridge and a hand that now reached confidently for his. If you value children's safety, tap like and tell us where you're watching from. The next hours would be consumed with interviews and documentation. Fernanda's formal petition for protective measures, Helena's list of filings to be made, Paulo's updated medical charts. Clarice would mobilize legal counsels and a communications plan meant to tilt public sentiment back in her direction, and there would be attempts to silence those who spoke the truth. Ricardo felt the weight of that impending pressure like a second tide, one that could wash away fragile testimony if not met with steady protection. In the quieter moments, between forms and referrals, Ricardo learned to do the small things. He learned to buy groceries not as a procurement manager, but as a father with a child who preferred bananas with a certain softness. He learned the cadence of coaxing a reluctant spoon into a mouth that had forgotten regular meals. He read to Isabella from a book with clumsy characters, and found himself preferring the soft hum of a child's story to the sharp efficiency of a corporate briefing. Lourdes came by the hospital with a small bag of home-baked biscuits she had made in a kitchen without padlocks. She watched as Isabella accepted one with the caution of someone who had been denied trust, and when the child finally relented and smiled, Lourdes pressed her hand to her chest, as if the victory belonged to someone who had fought in silence for too long. Over the coming days, detectives, not the dramatic sort from television, but steady officers who worked on family welfare cases, began to collect the kind of data that matters in court. timestamps, purchase orders, nanny schedules, communications between household staff and managers. They logged when the pantry was last opened, who had access codes, and whether there were written rules about food as a method of discipline. In recorded depositions, staff recounted practices and directives that had, collectively, made a child's access to nourishment conditional. The evidence was procedural and stark. It did not need embellishment to be devastating. An audit of household orders showed bulk deliveries of specialty items for Clarice's events, and a set of instructions about restricted access to certain areas circulated in emails. Security footage revealed times when the pantry door was closed and locked during hours when the child would plausibly have wanted to eat. Lords' statement had the bluntness of a witness who had chosen to act. She had been fired for giving a child food. These were not accusations delivered in the language of rumor. They were documents and observations that would later be organized into a narrative a court could act on. Ricardo watched the files accumulate like a new kind of balance sheet, one that accounted not in dollars, but in safety. But evidence alone does not secure outcomes. The other side had resources of its own, a polished lawyer ready to contest and a communications apparatus skilled in framing. Clarice's team prepared denials and alternative explanations. Certain tactics practiced for moments when public image might be at risk. They floated the idea that the cook had misinterpreted instructions, that routines had been misunderstood, that the family was being unfairly judged. Each of these would be countered with facts, medical charts, witness statements, and the quiet arithmetic of a child's weight. In the corridor of the hospital, between interviews and the hum of fluorescent lights, Ricardo found himself writing a new kind of memo, a daily plan for presence. It included attendance at medical appointments, scheduled meals, a rotation of caregivers who had no ties to the prior household hierarchy, and a commitment to therapy. He would not outsource his paternal role to a public relations firm or to rituals that looked good in press images. He would be present. The first public hints of a fight came as drips. A cautiously worded statement from Clarice's office about private family matters, a legal note from her lawyers questioning the propriety of external scrutiny. A few supporters on social media defended her, pointing to decades of charitable work and the photos that lined her biography. Ricardo watched the tides and kept returning to the child in the hospital bed, to the way she traced tiny circles on the sheet, and to the way the son she had drawn, imperfect and brave, still fit in his pocket. The process that would turn these initial acts into a courtroom drama had begun in earnest, but the center of the story remained small and human. Meals, naps, whispered reassurances, and a drawing that said, plainly, "Daddy happy." The filing of protective paperwork was a hinge that would open into a larger fight, and yet the most profound changes would be measured in daily rituals rather than press releases. He made a decision, quiet and resolute. He would not let the mechanics of power be weaponized against the truth. He would protect witnesses like lords. He would preserve evidence. He would, above all else, be present for his daughter. He would learn how to make porridge properly, how to sit through a bedtime story without checking his phone. That night, back in the hospital, Isabella fell asleep in his arms with the kind of trust that a child offers only when she knows someone will not leave. Ricardo held her and listened to the slow, even rhythm of her breathing, and he felt a kind of fierce gratitude that sharpened into determination. The battle ahead would be public and brutal in ways he could not yet fully imagine, but there was no alternative. The only currency that mattered now was reliability. Outside the hospital window, town lights pooled like coins on black velvet. Inside, a child slept. The first formal steps to protect her had been taken. The rest would require strategy, patience, and the stubborn insistence that safety could not be bought or negotiated away by spin. It would demand that he stand not as a man of wealth, but as a father who had finally decided to stay. The days after the emergency order felt to Ricardo like a race against a different kind of clock. It was no longer about mergers or quarterly targets. It was about timelines and timestamps, about records that could be subpoenaed and statements that could not be erased. Helena moved with the calm urgency of someone who had litigated crisis many times before. Motions drafted, affidavits collected, the emergency hearing calendared. Fernanda continued to manage the child protection angle, pulling together medical documentation and witness statements with procedural precision. Dr. Paulo updated charts. Lourdes, who had been both a witness and a quiet rescuer, agreed to formalize what she had already told them, a clear account, signed and witnessed. Ricardo insisted on one early, non-negotiable detail: that no one would be left exposed. He signed forms that paid for temporary relocation for Lourdes and other staff who feared reprisals, placed funds in escrow for legal support, and approved discreet security arrangements. He learned in the space of a week how to translate resources into protection without weaponizing them. For Lourdes, the gesture was practical and personal: a small apartment in a neighborhood she trusted, a phone line that could not be tracked back to the estate, a prepaid card for groceries. She accepted his help the way someone accepts a bandage, not because it erased the wound, but because it meant someone finally acknowledged it. Evidence accumulation became a rhythm. Security footage was catalogued and time-stamped. Emails and internal memoranda were retrieved. A line here about restricted access. A staff bulletin there reminding household workers of Clarice's behavioral guidelines for children in the estate's care. An audit of food deliveries showed disparities between the sumptuous purchases for events and the relative sparseness of daily, child-friendly provisions. Paulo's notes described a pattern consistent with prolonged inadequate nutrition. Lab results, anthropometric data, recommended interventions. Fernanda's investigative report connected the dots in language suited for a court. Dates, witness statements, and corroborating artifacts like the padlocked pantry and photographs taken at the hospital of the child's gaunt profile. On the morning of the emergency hearing, the courthouse had its own quiet, unforgiving light. The building smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Judge Beatriz Fonseca presided with a steady, unassuming authority that made the room feel smaller and more honest. Helena's filing was succinct. Immediate exclusive custody was necessary to prevent further harm, while an investigation proceeded. Dr. Marcelo Santos, representing Clarice, moved with the kind of patience polished by high-profile disputes, appeal to parental rights, highlight the trauma of separation, question the haste of emergency measures. He argued the family had deeper context and extenuating circumstances that required calm adjudication. The first witnesses were brief and clinical. A nurse verified the admission and procedures. Dr. Paulo explained the clinical picture and his recommendations for monitored refeeding and psychological support. He did not dramatize. He spoke in the clear registry of medicine: numbers, protocols, foreseeable consequences if not addressed. His testimony was compact and devastating in its clarity. The labs and the physical exam are consistent with chronic undernourishment, he said. This is not an acute lapse remedied by a single meal. There is a pattern that needs interruption and protection. Fernanda laid out the social services findings with a documentarian steadiness. She reviewed timelines, recited statements from staff, and emphasized the immediate need for a safety plan. Our role is to ensure a child's welfare, she said. Given the pattern of evidence, medical markers, direct witness statements, and restricted access to food within the household, we recommend temporary protective custody pending full investigation. Then came Lourdes. In the courtroom she was smaller than she had been in the hospital corridor, but her voice was steady, shaped by something that no money could buy: moral clarity. She told the judge, plainly and without flourish, what she had done and why. "I hid crackers in my apron pocket," she said, eyes occasionally flicking to where Isabella had sat behind his father's shoulder in earlier hearings. "I couldn't watch a child come to the kitchen and go away hungry. They told me to keep certain areas locked. I thought I was helping her. For that I was fired." Her hands did not tremble as much as her words might have suggested. There was a resolute economy to her testimony that made the courtroom lean closer. Under cross-examination, Dr. Marcello tried to frame her as biased, as someone whose dismissal had a legitimate managerial justification. He suggested memory lapses, malevolent motives, and the pressures of employment. Lords answered with the same plainness, refusing to be baited into melodrama. Her account matched a laundry list of other statements and the medical chart, and in the end, the corroboration mattered more than the theatrics of an attorney's questions. Clarice took the stand with the composed poise of someone used to being observed and photographed. She presented the public version of herself. Charitable, structured, a woman whose calendar was full of good works. Under questioning, she framed her practices as disciplined parenting, measured meals, guidelines meant to instill self-control, normative discipline mistaken for cruelty. But details were its own undoing. When asked about the padlocked cabinet, she offered a line about household rules. When pressed about staffing decisions, she spoke of managerial prerogatives and the difficulty of balancing philanthropy and family. At times, her answers felt rehearsed to the point of brittleness. At others, they contained small slips, phrases that sounded less like explanation and more like rationalization. What swung the day was not a dramatic confession, but the slow accretion of documentation. Security logs showed repeated instances when the pantry door was inaccessible during evening hours. Purchase histories indicated an abundance of event-specific groceries juxtaposed with minimal child-friendly supplies. Medical charts and lab panels painted the clinical contour of prolonged neglect. When the judge peered over the bundle of evidence, her questions were surgical. Did these items collectively suggest imminent risk? Did the doctor's recommendations indicate a need to limit access to mitigate further harm? Her ruling was direct. The judge granted temporary exclusive custody to Ricardo, citing the weight of the medical and testimonial evidence and the child's best interests. She restricted Clarice's unsupervised contact with Isabella, pending further evaluation, and ordered that both parents submit to psychological assessments as part of a broader inquiry. She also directed the Social Services Office to continue its investigation and referred the case for possible criminal review based on documented neglect. The ruling placed legal constraints around Clarice without labeling her permanently. It was a protective measure designed to prioritize the child's safety while the full facts were assessed. Outside the courthouse, the cameras were waiting like a weather system. Clarice's spokesperson issued a carefully calibrated statement about the pain of separation and the importance of due process. Her legal team announced their intention to contest the emergency measures aggressively. A few of her philanthropic allies released guarded endorsements of her care and character. The early social media chatter came fast, sympathies and condemnations in equal measure. For a time, the public felt like a jury made anonymous by algorithms. Ricardo felt a strange detachment as he left the building with Isabella at his side. The victory in court had the muted taste of relief rather than triumph. He had won the legal instrument the child needed, but the fight was far from over. He had expected backlash, and it arrived in the forms that such battles often take: threats of litigation, attempts to discredit witnesses, and the first rumblings of a media campaign aimed at muddying facts with emotion. Clarice's allies moved to protect her image. Press releases emphasized her years of charitable service. A series of photos from past campaigns, handing out meals to the needy, smiling amid community events, were recirculated with captions that urged perspective. On the other side, anonymous social posts began to target Lords, questioning her motives and suggesting she had been dismissed for reasons unrelated to benevolence. Emails from unknown addresses arrived at staff homes with veiled warnings about future employment prospects. The legal road was long and dirty in ways the city's tabloids loved. Ricardo refused to respond to every provocation. Instead, with Helena's guidance, he chose a measured path: transparency where appropriate, protection where necessary. He authorized the controlled release of redacted documents to vetted journalists, copies of the hospital's medical summary, portions of Fernanda's report, and the security logs that supported the timeline. He refused to feed frenzy with sensational details. His aim was to make the factual record harder to obscure. Pedro Carneiro, the investigative reporter who had texted him early on, proved invaluable. He published a piece that focused on verified facts and the voices of professionals. It wasn't an exposé that attacked Clarice. It was careful reporting that illuminated the systemic failures that had allowed a child to be deprived. The initial attempts to intimidate witnesses were blunt and ugly. Julia, who had managed the household and who had been present for many of the interactions now under scrutiny, received calls from people who implied she'd lose future references if she cooperated. A lawyer representing unnamed staff threatened to sue Lords for defamation. Someone tried to hack a hospital email account. Each act seemed aimed at doing what power often does when cornered: scatter fear among those who would speak. Ricardo pushed back on two fronts. Legally, Helena filed motions to protect witnesses and sought sanctions for any harassment that could be documented. Practically, he increased security for those who feared retaliation, offered legal aid and counseling support, and paid for relocation when safe distance was necessary. And he made a public, limited statement: no recrimination, no martyrdom, affirming his commitment to his daughter's recovery and the integrity of the process. He would not be silent, but neither would he let the battle become a spectacle at the child's expense. Clarice's counter-strategy shifted toward litigation. Her team filed a civil complaint that alleged defamation and procedural improprieties in the emergency removal. The legal back and forth stretched into depositions and discovery demands, tethering both sides to legal counsel. Helena responded with her own documentation and a steady insistence that the medical facts could not be ignored. The court's docket filled with motions, each one a measuring stick of how power sought to use the system. Yet despite the noise, the criminal referral that the judge had made meant a parallel path of investigation, separate detectives and prosecutors who would examine whether the documented neglect rose to the level of criminal offense. That prospect was what most worried Clarice's defenders, far more than any court of public opinion. Amid legal maneuvers, the slow work of healing continued. Dr. Marcos Andrade arrived as the child's psychologist, experienced in trauma-informed care for children. He did not rush toward diagnosis. Instead, he built rituals. Play therapy began with non-threatening activities: blocks, stories, and puppets. In these controlled spaces, a child could show fear without naming it, could enact conflict with toys, and could learn that emotions have a place and are manageable. Marcos also worked with Ricardo, coaching him on predictable routines and attunement strategies. It was not psychotherapy as an instant cure, but as a map for consistent care. Meals became ritualized tests of trust. At home now, the pantry had no padlock in sight. Instead, there were cupboards labeled by color and meal charts pinned to the fridge. Ricardo learned how to coax different textures into a child's mouth and how to accept when a bite was refused without turning it into a battle. They celebrated small things: a full plate, an extra spoonful, the first night when Isabella slept straight through without flinching awake. The nutritionist's plans were followed to the letter: slow refeeding, monitoring for electrolyte imbalances, and iron supplementation. Her weight increased gradually, a line on a chart that, to observers, might have seemed technical, but to Ricardo was a quiet, daily triumph. School reintegration was another step. With a carefully coordinated plan between the child's pediatric team and the school counselor, Isabella returned to a classroom monitored for progress, with thoughtful staff informed of her needs but bound by confidentiality. The first day back, she carried a small backpack and clutched her stuffed rabbit. She did not shout or sob. She moved with the unhurried private bravery of a child reclaiming a routine. She made a drawing of a classroom and added a small figure she labeled "Friend." The teacher praised her drawing, and the praise was the sort that builds self-esteem rather than spectacle. The public fight dragged on in the background. Clarice filed counterclaims and demanded depositions. Helena answered and countered. Pedro's reporting continued, careful and factual, while other outlets spun alternative narratives. The legal process stretched. A few of Clarice's allies began to distance themselves as the risk of association grew. Others held firm. The court docket filled with hearings about evidence preservation, witness confidentiality, and the boundaries of parental rights. Through it all, the judge's earlier orders held supervised visitation conditions and psychological evaluations were required before any unsupervised contact might be considered. That procedural scaffolding gave Ricardo a working margin of safety. At home, the rituals multiplied. Ricardo learned to pack a lunch that would please a child who had become wary of food. He sat in the back of the school auditorium at a parent meeting and felt the odd mix of vulnerability and resolve. These were small tasks that once would have been delegated, now carefully tended by a man who had come to measure himself by the constancy of presence. He traded fast business trips for 2-day blocks at home. He rearranged his calendar to prioritize bedtime stories and dentist appointments. Friends who used to joke about his lifestyle of travel noticed the change and either adapted or faded. Therapy sessions layered in the soft work of emotional repair. With Dr. Marcos's help, Isabella learned basic vocabulary for feelings: sad, scared, safe, and practiced naming them without the fear that naming might make them grow. The psychologist used drawings and pretend play to allow the child to reframe episodes that had been confusing and frightening. The child's drawings, which had at first been scribbled suns and solitary figures, grew more complex. A house with 2 windows, a small person holding hands with a larger one, a bright, patchy lawn. The image of Daddy Happy that had once fit his pocket now made it onto the refrigerator in a more elaborate form. Daddy and me at the park. As the months folded into each other, the immediate legal frenzy softened into a steady, lower-grade contest. Legal teams negotiated the boundaries of evidence, subpoenas were issued, and depositions were given under oath. Some staff members who had been reticent found courage with Helena's support and the knowledge that they would be protected if they spoke. Lourdes continued to be a powerful, albeit quiet, presence in the child's life. She visited once, bringing home-cooked food, and sat unobtrusively on the couch while Ricardo read aloud. When asked, she said she had no desire to be at the center of the storm. She wanted instead to see a child eat without fear. Clarice's arc was more complicated than headlines suggested. In private filings and in sealed reports, her legal counsel argued she adopted unconventional parenting tactics rooted in extremes of discipline rather than malice. The public could not easily reconcile the woman who cut ribbons at a shelter with the woman whose household practices had, as evidence suggested, veered into harm. The court maintained its protective posture. The child's safety remained primary, and the referent criminal inquiry continued quietly under the purview of investigative authorities. Judges and prosecutors acted on evidence, not on reputations. One late afternoon, months after the phone call that had begun the chain of events, Ricardo took Isabella to a small public park near their neighborhood. It was simple. A pond where ducks gathered, a ring of benches, the kind of place where the city's hum felt pleasantly distant. They carried a paper bag of seeds. The sun splayed across the water and turned ripples into sequined fragments. Isabella, now a little fuller in the cheeks and steadier on her feet, scattered seeds with the concentration of someone performing a small, happy task. Ducks competed for crumbs. A child nearby asked to share some bread, and Isabella handed over a handful with a smile that was both tentative and luminous. They sat on a bench and watched the animals. Ricardo felt a tenderness he had not allowed himself since the early panic. The legal work was not over, far from it, and the risk of renewed media storms or further litigation remained. But this moment felt like a margin of ordinary joy that law and money could not manufacture and that absence had nearly destroyed. Isabella leaned against him, and he noticed the ordinary weight of a child, the steady rhythm of a breath that no longer drew attention for its fragility. He pointed at a duck that had the audacity to steal from another, and made them both laugh over what was, in the end, an insignificant piece of theatre. They walked back to the car with a few drawings tucked under Isabella's arm. One, which she had insisted he keep, showed a figure with a large smile and a smaller figure holding a hand. Above them, the letters read, in a child's slanted script, "Me and Daddy happy." Ricardo did not think of headlines or filings. He thought of the day when he had missed a dinner, of the long list of apologies that would never be enough, and of this new quotidian currency that could, day by day, be earned. The public story remained messy. Clarice continued to mount defenses and speak to her own pain in softer interviews. Some of her supporters described a woman attacked unfairly. Others watched the layer of documents and testimony accumulate and felt the prevailing reality shifting. The criminal inquiry moved forward at its own pace, subject to evidentiary standards and prosecutorial discretion. The judicial process unfolded without guarantee of sensational outcomes. Ricardo had learned to accept that justice in a system is often slow and procedural, and that protection for a child can be immediate while accountability might remain unresolved for longer. Throughout, he held to a set of simple practices that became the scaffolding of their rebuilt life. Morning cereal that was not a battleground, a bedtime hour that was non-negotiable, someone reliable to pick Isabella up from school, and the willingness to sit in a waiting room for hours if a therapy session took longer than scheduled. He watched his schedule shrink in terms of travel and expand in terms of small, present demands. There were nights he still woke with the residue of panic. What if a padlock returned in another form? But those nights were less frequent, cushioned by the slower accumulation of peaceful mornings. At one point, a deposition forced Clarice to answer questions about an internal memo from the estate that used the phrase behavioral boundaries. She testified about her childhood and a strict upbringing that she said had informed her approach to discipline. In the sterile language of a legal room, her private history was passed for motive and mitigation. The judge, when weighing evidence, focused on harm, not on biography. For Ricardo, the testimony was a reminder. People are rarely wholly villainous or wholly virtuous. Clarice's behavior could be contextualized without being excused. The court's priority, Isabella, remained the moral center of every decision. Months later, when the judge revisited custody arrangements in a follow-up hearing, the results were purposefully incremental and protective. The court extended Ricardo's primary custodial role and mandated supervised visits after Clarice completed psychological evaluations and parenting courses approved by the court. The judge ordered continuing monitoring and required proof of follow-through before any unsupervised contact could be resumed. The ruling did not criminally convict anyone. It did not in itself heal the small betrayals that had occurred. It did, however, create legal space for safety and for measured attempts at rehabilitation. As the legal dust settled into routine filings, Ricardo's life grew around the axis of care. He started small rituals, Saturday pancakes with the exact temperature of butter, a silly handshake before school, a special story he reserved for the nights he worked late that tethered his days to something tangible. Friends who were close enough to ask hard questions noticed the difference and offered support in ways that mattered. Showing up at school plays, doing laundry when he couldn't, bringing a casserole when an appointment was long. Isabella's recovery had markers that were both clinical and ordinary. Her labs normalized gradually. She laughed with less reserve. She made friends at school. Her drawings grew more detailed. Her son became a world with trees and other figures. Once at the pediatrician's office, she announced to a nurse with the casual authority of a child who had been coached and nurtured, "I like carrots now." The nurse smiled, and Ricardo felt a relief so ordinary it almost stunned him. One evening, years removed from the frantic flight that had returned him to the estate, Ricardo sat with a folder of the past's documents, medical charts, court orders, witness statements, arranged like a ledger of what had been done. He did not stare at the legal victories as trophies. Instead, he catalogued them as tools that had been necessary to secure a small human life. He thought often about Lourdes and the many quiet people who had refused to be silent. He had written checks, yes, but he had also learned to listen and to be present. There were still moments that proved how fragile trust can be. A television segment that framed Clarice as a wronged mother would sometimes reappear in a social feed. An old colleague reached out to debate the complexities of parenting and power. On those days, Ricardo returned to the same core principle that had guided him since the hospital corridor. Prioritize the child's dignity and safety above all else. He taught Isabella that she had the right to be fed, to rest, and to be believed. He taught himself to be the kind of man who put a child's meals on par with any meeting on his calendar. The park scene remained, in many ways, the most powerful measure of change. There, in simple exchanges with ducks and other children, the guileless currency of a child's trust was the barometer of progress. They returned often, sometimes with sandwiches for the ducks, sometimes with nothing but a small ball to kick around. Those afternoons were not free of the past, but they were, in their small way, joyful. A once fractured routine had become an axis for healing. On a quiet evening after one such outing, Isabella set out a new drawing on the refrigerator. There was a bench, a pond, a child with a rabbit by her side, and a larger figure beside her. Above them, she had written, with the hopeful immediacy of a 7-year-old who had been through months of uncertainty, "Me and Daddy safe." Ricardo stood in the kitchen and read the letters slowly, feeling the words like something stitched into him. Safety, he realized, was not a single legal order or a single dramatic act. It was 1,000 small repetitions that accumulated into a life. The legal contest continued to unwind in its own time. Clarice pursued civil avenues, and the criminal inquiry proceeded under prosecutorial discretion. Some parts of the record remained sealed, others were plain as public filings. Regardless of the final legal endpoints, the child had primary protection, and that, for Ricardo, was the outcome that mattered most. At night, as Isabella slept with the rabbit tucked under her chin, Ricardo sometimes walked through the quiet of the house and found himself in front of the pantry where once a padlock had sealed access. Now the cupboards were open, labelled and orderly, the contents chosen for nutrition and comfort rather than as instruments of control. He took a breath that felt less like atonement and more like continuity, a recognition that he could not undo absence, but could choose every day to be available. He had learned that wealth could accelerate access to protection, and he had learned to use it without let it become the only tool. More importantly, he had learned that presence was not merely a sentiment, but a practice, showing up for the small, sometimes tedious demands of caregiving. The sphere of his life had narrowed in ways that felt right. Boardrooms still required his attention at times, but he no longer let a flight or a meeting supplant his child's bedtime. He measured success now by a different metric. In the end, the most decisive change was neither legal nor financial. It was relational. Isabella, once a whisper on a phone, had become the person whose rhythms directed the household's tempo. She began to trust that a hand would be there to feed her, to tuck the rabbit under the pillow, to say the same goodnight each evening. Her drawing on the refrigerator, the imperfect figures, the sun slightly off-center, the shaky letters, declared what the courts and the doctors and the lawyers had tried to secure by other means, a space where a child could be a child. If you found this story meaningful, please share it with someone who cares about children's safety, and subscribe to follow more investigative human interest stories.